June 15th. I think we've had quite a few headlines overnight. I'm joined here today with our special guest speakers, Robin Mills, CEO of KMR Energy, Lori Hitayon, MENA Director, Natural Resource Governance Institute, and Henning Gloystein, Director of Energy, Climate, and Resources at Eurasia Group. Thanks for joining the show. I just wanted to first kick off with our news digest. We've had a bunch of headlines, of course, with India soon to overtake China as a driver of oil demand. We have the announcements that came out from Shell. Robin, if I can start with you, what do you think stood out the most for your aspect with the headlines overnight?
Well, I think the India news is probably the more consequential in the longer term. But for me, as a former Shell person, I found the Shell news pretty interesting. And the idea that Shell has said, okay, we've cut our oil production enough for now. We're not going, we're actually going to try and grow oil production over the next up to 2030, and increase the dividend. And that new green investments will have to compete much more successfully and aggressively with oil and gas investments for capital. It's been trailed, I suppose, for a few days or even a few weeks, and BP kind of went down a similar road a few months back as well, and quite successfully for their share price. But I think this has kind of become inevitable because the gap in share price performance between the European majors and the American majors is so big. European majors have been trading at half the multiples of their US counterparts, and I think the European majors just have a dilemma, which is they've said that they want to transition to lower carbon energy. The market has not rewarded that. So if you're a environmentally focused investor, you won't invest in oil companies at all, no matter how much renewables they do. But if you're an oil and gas focused investor, you will look at the Americans, because they are leaning into oil and gas still much more successfully, and they see it has a good run, at least up until the 2030s.
What signals do you think that sends from a geopolitical aspect? We've seen social media buzz with this announcement. What is your outlook there? What do you think are the consequences?
I think there's a few consequences, but one of them is are the oil companies going to lead the energy transition in terms of renewables? No, probably not. And they're probably not the best and the right companies to do that anyway. The American companies, to the extent that they do anything about climate change, it's in the fields of carbon capture, biofuels, things like that, which to be fair to them is a benefit to the core business. So, and you'll see, I think the European companies going more into that as well. They all have different emphasis. Some of them are like, well, we're going to do electric vehicle charging. Some we're going to do hydrogen. They have slightly different emphasis, but bigger picture, trying to concentrate on things closer to the core business. But secondly, of course, there hasn't been that much competition in the past few years from Western companies for investment in oil and gas. Now some of these companies are going to invest a bit more aggressively, perhaps provide a bit more competition to OPEC out to the end of the decade. And you have some big new discoveries in places like Namibia, where Shell and Total are very much active.
Lori, I just wanted to bring you in to get your insights. What headline do you think stood out the most to you?
To tell you, I guess, I share with Robin this issue of the Shell announcement, because we've been focusing a lot in the region about the role of the national oil companies and the energy transition. And there we were looking should they be the ones supporting the energy transition in the countries? Are they the spoilers or accelerators, etc.? So I think, and there were we were looking at what the IOCs were doing and comparing between IOCs and NOCs. So it was interesting to see how the IOCs at that time, we were a bit doubtful. I remember many colleagues of mine at the organization saying that, Shell's announcement, BP's announcement, before the Ukraine war, all wanting to go green, changing names, etc. They were watching how long that will last. So I guess we're getting the answer now. So that's one thing, I guess. And I think one other thing that was interesting for me to read, it's that a German report and Iran actually, and saying that Iranians are the ones who are not kind of stopping or not enthusiastic about the JCPOA or to go back to the deal, because there was kind of a perception that this was the US who wasn't interested, or the US was putting the bar very high for a solution, and the Europeans were more like, you know, guys, you left in 2018, so or 16, 18, I don't remember anymore. Like that, we have so many dates. So the US left, so maybe they were a bit siding with the Iranians. So now you see, like, bluntly, the Germans saying that no, maybe there was a bigger push from the Iranians not to be much excited about it. And definitely, I guess because we said it so many times here, that between having a deal with the US that couldn't last, and between having that nuclear power that will have a lasting effect, because then it will balance, or it will equal kind of the relations or the negotiations, I think the Iranians will go with the nuclear. And now that they are like easily selling their whatever they're producing or whatever they're stocked with oil, so that is helping as well, like to really put the JCPOA or any kind of deal with the Americans, and not as a priority, but as second priority.
Do you think that we'll see anything kind of tangible soon? You know, we keep seeing these headlines, even in the Wall Street Journal, about quiet diplomatic pushes in Oman. Do you think that the US and Iran will be able to make something more structurally, I would say, tangible?
Look, we always said, like, Oman was always playing a role, a mediator role, and very quiet role. You know, they're very good at playing it, like very low profile, etc. But at the same time, we always said that as long as there is this nuclear issue, like, the Americans wouldn't want completely to forget about Iran. But at the same time, it depends where the priorities are. Definitely, there are a shift again in the region for the regional powers to take things into their hands. So this rapprochement that happened between Iran, Saudi Arabia was very important, etc. So I think they're kind of, okay, let's deal with our internal regional stuff, and let's focus on that a bit, and that the US, etc., and relations, we keep it as second, not important. The same that with what Saudis are doing as well. Like, you know, it's like, okay, you know what? We're not going to wait for you guys to decide when you want to go into negotiations, when you don't want to go into negotiations, whatever suits you. We have our own agenda in the region. So I think, and Iran and Saudi Arabia agree on that point, that they should take things into their hands and play their role as regional powers. And this is what we're seeing.
Henning, I just want to bring you in as well. What stood out to you the most overnight and this morning that you're thinking about and looking at?
So, I mean, the India headline there, or the IEA headline, that India will overtake China as the key growth, demand growth driver for oil consumption. It's not really surprising in that sense, because, I mean, India's oil consumption has been rising very fast, but it is remarkable because this is coinciding with the year that India overtook China as the most populous nation on earth, and in many ways, geopolitically, economically, and in all terms of oil consumption, India is now becoming a major global power, not just the biggest emerging market, and that's a big shift. You will also later, India will be hosting G20. India is a key player in the oil factor and in the Quad, so all these security and tech alliances. The EU is trying to forge a trade deal with India. So I think geopolitically, India is entering a center, entering basically the world as a major power, and this is important, and you'll see it in oil consumption. But for those who say, like, India is going to be the next China, including for oil consumption, I think they'll be disappointed, because India's demand growth, yes, the demand growth is there in terms of percentages, but in terms of outright oil consumption, India is nowhere near what China is or has been in terms of demand growth, even over the last years. You can see that in passenger car sales. China's car sales probably have peaked, but they're still anywhere between 1.5 million and 2 million cars per month new on the road. In India, it's way below that. It's under 1 million, and that is a big difference. So if India is the driver of global oil demand growth, that's great, and it's probably good for India, because, as I say, India's entering center stage global geopolitically. But if you're an oil producer, India being the key driver of oil demand growth is not a replacement of China. And I think that is sort of something that as we're coming out of COVID, the new oil demand world that is emerging is China is not the old China that has come out of COVID. And India, yes, it is a big demand driver, but it is not the next China.
And India is also, I think, competing with China from an energy transition standpoint as well, implementing new technologies and really driving that aspect. Do you have any thoughts on that too, in the sense of oil consumption, how that will impact?
It's a good point, because I remember when I was living in Asia that people were saying like, the electric vehicle transition in India will never work. They can't, their grid isn't stable enough. They don't have enough power. That's not the case. India's electric vehicle transition is kicking off right now. And not just in terms of consumption, but India is emerging as a major producer of electric vehicles, affordable, and that I think we'll start seeing as an export product. And I think, but it's a hunch more than an analytical conclusion. But I think the EV transition in India is about to kick off on a major scale, and that will impact its future oil consumption as well. So in terms of energy transition, India might actually there really compete with China and really be a major driver of a global energy transition, because for India, it's a massive opportunity to skip all the problems of industrializing in the way that the rest of the world did, which is based on fossil fuels. And also it's a job creator, and it's also a necessity for India, because if you look at the climate data for India, it looks really scary. So for them, it's an opportunity plus a necessity, which of course kind of applies to the rest of the world as well. But I think for India, it's really an acute factor. It's like, if we want to become rich, we need to do it in a different way to the rest of the world. And it is driving policies there, because so Prime Minister Narendra Modi, what everyone thinks of him politically, is the one thing he's the greenest prime minister in Indian history. He really sees the green transition as an opportunity and a necessity for India's people.
Robin, I just wanted to bring you in on that too, just on that EV point. I think I saw in your weekly bulletin as well that it was 2/3 of people in the UAE and Saudi would also be open to buying EVs. Of course, we saw the first headline today on the News Digest. Robin, what is your outlook for that? You said it's more long term, but do you think that there can be change where it's going to really have an impact more into the mid and short term?
Well, around Dubai, right? Even 6 months ago, to see a Tesla was a real rarity. Now you see them all the time. So that's pretty dramatic for me, because there isn't a good reason to buy a Tesla in the UAE in terms of like saving on fuel or anything. The fuel prices are low enough for that. But they've become highly fashionable, and they've come to the point where people are very comfortable driving them. And they're a kind of show-off car, of course. They attract some attention, they have great performance and everything, but they've really come into the mainstream. And I think that's remarkable. There's no kind of subsidies or incentives or anything to buy a Tesla here. You do have those kind of incentives for electric vehicles in the US, in Europe, and very much in China. And we've seen a dramatic acceleration across all those markets, and particularly across the US, which was lagging a bit outside California. The tax incentives have now come in again, make electric vehicles very attractive there too. So this is a new phenomenon. I still think the oil industry is not kind of fully woken up to this. Still doesn't take EVs seriously. You see a lot of commentary about why EVs aren't mass market for various reasons. But that's kind of ignoring the reality of what people are actually buying. It will take a while for these to have an impact on oil demand, have a major impact, because if EVs reach 30% of purchases, as they have done in some markets, but the fleet turns over slowly. Average age of a car nowadays is 13 years, so cars last a lot longer than they used to. But it will start chipping away at oil demand, and by the late 2020s, early 2030s, we could be seeing a really material impact, and we could be seeing a peak in oil demand and starting a decline. And if you look here and there, if you look at specific markets, you look at gasoline market, for example, in certain areas, even in China, diesel market and so on, that's already gone past its peak. EVs are not the whole story, but they're certainly part of that.
I also just wanted to get your insights as well, just following up with Lori about the Iran deal. What are your thoughts on that? And of course, Germany blaming Iran and the outlook for something more tangible moving forward in the future.
Yeah, it's slightly difficult. I suppose, I mean, the primary blame for not having an Iran deal obviously still remains the US and Trump having pulled out of what was a working agreement. But, that's 5 years ago now. So at some point we have to move past that and say there have been opportunities to reactivate the deal or come up with some kind of a new deal. And there's blame to go around on why that hasn't happened. I think the Biden administration missed a chance early on when they came into office. But I think, having an Iranian regime that has become more hardline, that has also is pretty short on competence in that key circle, and I think would struggle even to negotiate a very robust and successful agreement. There are some major sticking points in terms of what the US could realistically give in terms of its political climate. But you've seen signs like the removal of Ali Shamkhani as national security advisor. He was a well-respected figure, Arabic speaker, and so on, who'd played a major role in improving Iran's relations with Saudi Arabia, and yet he's now been sidelined. So you're seeing kind of moves, I think, on the hardline side to consolidate, and you might think that's maneuvering for kind of a succession of leadership in Iran and, at some point, but it does make it hard for them to continue to negotiate coherently, even if they had the will to come up with a new deal.
Lori, we've mentioned Iran, but there's of course a lot going on in the region from a geopolitical aspect impacting energy demand, also political aspects as well. What other elements are you currently focused on and currently reading the tea leaves of? What other things are sticking out to you at the moment?
Look, as you said, like there are things happening in the region and moving parts. So I think it's very interesting. As everyone, we are looking at how much China is going to keep on being involved in the politics of the region. I guess inviting the Palestinian president to China is I don't know if it doesn't have an impact definitely on oil and gas, but that definitely it's interesting to see like what the outcome will be, like what they're trying to do to understand, So on that front, because basically the peace deal is that no one talks about the Israeli-Palestinian deal. It comes out when we read like analysis about like this is one condition for the Saudis to accept to normalize relations with Israel. That card is important, but then Americans are not interested in doing anything. Then you see like the Palestinian president is invited to China. It's interesting to see what's happening. Definitely more interesting for the region, I guess. It's this trip that the Prince Mohammed bin Salman is going to do to France, to go to Paris, and so that is interesting. That is going to be more interesting to watch, with implications on the politics of the region, on the economics of the region, and basically the role that Saudi Arabia is trying to play in the region as a leading power, regional leading power. And I guess like the region, the MENA region is not doing well, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE understand that they cannot only be in a good position politically, economically, while the rest are lagging. You have 4 or 5 countries that are at war or completely like unstable economically, others that are really in a very uncertain position. So I guess like the next step will be like really for the UAE and Saudi Arabia to be able to look at the neighborhood and see how the neighborhood could be really fixed, so that every benefit that they are getting to play like global citizens, as Robin is saying, like having a Tesla puts the UAE, the citizens of the UAE as global citizens, being the same as the Europeans or the Americans, and they don't identify as, let's say, the Lebanese or the Yemeni or the Syrian, etc. And that is like because there is a big shift in the region between like countries like Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Tunisia, and what the UAE and Saudi Arabia are aspiring for. So there is a political leadership role that they need to play besides the economic role that they are playing. And then I think and then it will be a different transaction, because usually the Gulf region was always like, yeah, we put money in these countries to stabilize them, and we want maybe some allegiance or not to attack us, neutralize them, and that's it. I don't think that is going forward anymore. I think the UAE, when they want to put the money, they want a return on investment, and they want it economically. It's not anymore about politics only. So it's beyond that. The same for Saudi Arabia. Wherever they want to put money, they want to make sure that they're investing, they're getting something in return, etc. So, and I think this is going to be the way forward, because only if you elevate the conditions of living in the region, then it will be more effective even for Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the long term. So I think this is very important, and this will be the discussion for the future of the region, basically, and the role Saudi Arabia and the UAE are playing. So we're going to watch. We're more interested in what's going to happen in Paris more than what's happening in Beijing with Mahmoud Abbas.
But also, speaking about countries that are, I would say, somewhat close to the region, actually a little bit farther. But of course, Turkey, Erdogan wins. We're already seeing some impact with NATO. What is your outlook with Turkey at the moment, and how that might impact the region or play in terms of relationships and geopolitics?
Look, I guess for Turkey as well, now it's all about economics. They're not doing well. We said it before. So I think there is an economic angle for whatever he will be taking. So, and most probably now the Turkish president is in a situation where he thinks that maybe this will be the last term for him. And maybe, I'm saying, you never know, like in the region. So definitely this is where he wants to fortify, strengthen his legacy, etc. And definitely he doesn't want he plays the populist card, etc. And he's very popular with the people, etc. And the result is like, look, he won another election when people thought that he will not. I think that he wants a stronger economically, understands that economically stronger Turkey is the way forward. So we'll wait and see how he's going to approach that thing with the region and in the region, and definitely with the Europeans as well, and the US.
Henning, I just wanted to get your aspect on one thing too. One, we're talking about China in terms of EV, uptake and that push. But at the same time, in our recommended reading, we had that question: what is causing the record rise in both China's coal production and imports? Can you just speak on that a bit from your perspective?
Sure. Well, I could try. So the one thing in China that happened over the last year is in coal production and coal consumption is that China is ramping up its use of coal because they got terrified by the increase or surging natural gas prices, energy prices last year because of what was happening in Europe. So they have decided that as part of their energy transition, they're going to try and go 2 steps ahead and 1 step back, 2 steps ahead by doubling down on anything that's renewable power generation. We can see the surge in offshore wind power, the electric vehicle rollout, and so forth. But 1 step back by rolling back on the expansion of use of natural gas in favor of coal use. Now, first of all, they've also expanded their domestic coal mining capacity, but they're also importing more coal now, and they stopped their multi-year blockade of Australian coal imports, and that is factoring into that as well. And then finally, what you're also now seeing, China, very sadly, is again seeing a massive heat wave, which is driving up electricity consumption in China. But also related to that heat wave, we're seeing droughts in China again, which is meaning that the hydropower output is very much diminished versus the long-term average. If you look at stuff like the Yellow Rivers, the Yangtze Dam in China, the hydro levels they're really, really poor, as in very low. And that is necessitating an increase in coal-fired power generation. So put that all together, and China's coal consumption, coal imports are up significantly, which is sadly not a good story, but it's really not their fault because most of it is related to global or international problems, at least.
I just want to bring up the survey question real quick, and Henning, stay with you. Of course, we had comments from the IEA about global oil demand. The survey today is global oil demand will peak by decade end, according to IEA's new forecast. Of course, the head of the IEA. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts on that perspective?
I can keep that quite short. I agree that it will peak before the end of the decade. I think the question is whether it's towards the end of the decade or earlier, towards the middle of the decade. But I don't have a date. But overall, I agree.
Okay, perfect. Robin, what is your perspective on that survey question as well?
I think it's true. Yes, I think it will peak before the end of the decade or around then. But if you look at the discrepancy between the IEA's net zero report and its medium-term oil outlook, you'll see that they have growth up to about, I think, 106 million barrels per day in the medium-term oil outlook. In the net zero scenario, by 2030, we should be down at 70-something million barrels per day, which I don't think anybody believes is going to happen. If we do have a drop in demand, it's going to be minimally from kind of current levels. So that just shows how far we are from a net zero path that the IEA has laid out, and that goes back to the issues we talked about earlier. India taking over from China. Indian demand growth will continue. Shell facing its strategic challenges and looking at producing more oil because there's demand for it, and that goes for the Gulf producers too. If they don't produce, and indeed we turn out to have 106 million barrels per day of oil demand and not sufficient investment, prices will go through the roof, and there'll be a lot of blame for the oil producers. So they're in a bit of a no-win situation.
Laurie, what's your perspective from your angle looking at the region as well? Do you agree or do you disagree with that comment?
Look, I think that the region, without saying that if I agree or disagree on all these efforts that are being put by these organizations to do the forecast, etc. So basically what I know that in the region, everybody is looking into these things because like many of the region, the countries of the region are resource-rich countries. Maybe Saudi Arabia and UAE can be in they are in a safer position, but imagine Iraq. And with all these data that are coming, is Iraq being really building the future Iraq or not? Or just like keep on pumping and saying that, oh, we have so much and then we're safe. We don't need to diversify our economy. Algeria is looking into these things and thinking, okay, how long can I continue with this business model that I have or the social contract that I have without doing changes? So I think beyond like these statistics or these numbers about like when the peak will come, etc., we're looking at more of the internal dynamics in the countries where they're more vulnerable. So that's more important because this is like at the end of the day, the countries will continue existing, and you want like countries to be really looking into the future and building a stronger future. So all indications are that there is like a big question mark about the demand for oil and gas. Okay, so it's not a supply issue, even though now everybody's talking about supply issue or demand issue. So what are these countries that are resource rich doing to really have a stronger economies in the future? This is the interesting part for me, because we see like red flags in Iraq and other places where they're completely like, you feel that they're unable to think about the future without oil, and they need to think about the future with less oil demand. So that's where I come from on this question.
Unfortunately, we have to close out pretty soon. 30 minutes goes by pretty quick, but Madeleine, can you bring up the results? And Henning, I just would like to go to you. Of course, there's a lot of topics going on this week. What are you looking at as we close out the week? And of course, heading out to the end of the quarter as well. What is your outlook from that perspective?
So politically, politics is the wrong term here, but the war in Ukraine is sadly still top of our mind. Ukraine's counteroffensive has clearly started. First, I'm not a military analyst, so I can't judge that. So, yeah, that is probably top of our mind. How will it impact politics? And is there any chance of things de-escalating? Because sadly, since the start of this war, well over a year ago now, things have only escalated, and this is sadly the trajectory that we still see. So that's top of mind. Economically, is and this is relevant for oil prices as well. Is the world economy doesn't look great. China's reopening hasn't been the rebound that everyone was hoping for. Europe is kind of officially in recession, and the US is sort of teetering and eyeing it as well. And whether the world can avoid a recession or not, I think economically is top of our mind.
Robin, what are the tea leaves that you're looking at as we close out the week, but of course getting towards the end of the first half of the year? What is on your mind as well?
Well, I think, the significant in the short term is this kind of seesawing of the oil price and general kind of seesawing down. When, if ever, will the sentiment change around? When will we see this very strong demand growth that the IEA and OPEC continue to see for the rest of the year? And the drawdowns in stocks and so on, and the shortfalls that might change OPEC around and see OPEC production increasing again. It's getting kind of increasingly hard to believe in that, and these I wonder how long these kind of optimistic forecasts will be maintained. But if they are, we ought to see prices going significantly higher again.
And then Laurie, we'll wrap up with you. What are your closing comments? What are you watching out and looking for?
As I said, we're looking forward to see what will happen in Paris this week.
Perfect. Amazing. Well, thank you very much. Of course, Robin, Laurie, and Henning for joining. And of course, our live audience on Zoom right now and across social media. Please feel free to follow Gulf Intelligence after this. And of course, our distinguished speakers who are very active as well to support all the content. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining and for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.